As you learn history, it empowers people.
Do we collectively see each other's humanity?
Rights, citizenship, the right to vote, it's never been granted. It's always been.
You have to dive into the deep with facets of our past, both the wonderful parts of it and ugly parts of it.
One of the interesting things about the early history of colonial Williamsburg is that, not everything was preordained. So if a visitor today goes and walks down the streets and sees programming and interpreters and such, that was not necessarily in the original plan. So I think Dr. Goodwin deserves a lot of credit for introducing the idea of interpretation, active interpretation to CW. He wrote a really interesting letter in 1935 to Mr. Rockefeller, arguing that it was important for us to have an interpretive program. And he basically lays out the justification for it is we've built this wonderful city with all these beautiful buildings, but the buildings have no voice. Goodwin argues quite rightly that they needed a human element into the buildings, and they needed to tell the stories, not just have the buildings be the story. So I think that was a really critical part of the history of colonial Williamsburg, but it was really Dr. Goodwin who was leading the charge to introduce interpretation at colonial Williamsburg. You really need to look at the timing of the beginning of colonial Williamsburg in 1926 and into the 30s, pretty close to the 150th anniversary of the birth of the country. People were very much interested in the story of the Founding Fathers, and I mean that literally, Founding Fathers. It was a very limited story. It was limited to the Founding Fathers, the first families of Virginia, kind of a very patriotic story that they would find here. So you're not going to hear a lot about the role of women, the role of blacks enslaved or free in that story. It was very much a patriotic story when the programs first started. Whether it was delivered or not, there were African Americans who were interpreting. Black coachmen is a great example of that. They were driving carriages very early on. They were taking care of the animals early on, and they were interpreting their role, as did the kitchen help. A lot of them were African Americans, and they would tell the story of their job, whether formally or informally, but that was all part of what a visitor would have heard when they came to colonial Williamsburg. A lot of attention gets paid to 1979 when the African American interpretation program began, but it's really important to remember that there were black interpreters who were very much a part of the early part of colonial Williamsburg. So in the beginning of World War II, there was certainly an active military community in the area, and they really kind of transitioned from interpretive programs to an educational program. So the soldiers from nearby bases would be bussed in, and they would attend lectures and hear the story of America's founding. As they prepared to do their training and ship off overseas, the idea was that they would understand and appreciate the role of democracy, the birth of the United States, and that would also be a big part of their motivation for going over and defending democracy and fighting. I think if you look at interpretation from the beginning at colonial Williamsburg, it certainly reacts and reflects American society. So in the 1960s, people are starting to question the civil rights for black Americans and starting to question the story that we were telling here. A lot of people were coming and questioning why we weren't telling more about enslaved and free blacks, telling more about the role of women in society. And so there was society, but there was also, I think, a generation of historians who were coming through educational institutions, and they were asking those same questions. They were doing research into the role of African Americans. And so it was seen as something that we weren't doing particularly well, and that we needed to really reflect the population that existed in Williamsburg at the time. We're constantly looking at what's going on in society, and as educators, we need to look at that and really think about the story that we're telling. Are we being inclusive? Are we telling the story of all Virginians, all Americans in our interpretations?
Hello, I'm Hope Wright. This spring on Us, Past, Present, Future, we are looking at how we discuss history. This month, we are addressing how we teach specifically about the American Revolution and the founding of the United States. From debates surrounding the 1619 Project around reframing the founding, to discussions about how we should approach the Founding Fathers. This topic is very much a part of the national conversation. Here to talk about that with me today are Ron Carnegie and James Ingram, nation builders who portray people of the past at Colonial Williamsburg, and Chief Stephen Adkins of the Chickahominy tribe. Now let's get started by each of you telling a little bit about yourselves. We'll start with you, Ron.
I was born and raised in Los Angeles, California. I've been living here in Virginia since '95. Worked at Colonial Williamsburg for just almost 27 years in several different roles. Now, as you say, as a nation builder, portraying George Washington.
Mm-hmm.
And I'm James Ingram. I've had the honor to portray in the last 24 years the Reverend Gowan pamphlet, the first black preacher ordained in North America. Was actually a Baptist minister that founded and co-founded the First Baptist Church, the only Baptist church in Williamsburg. I have had the honor to portray him for the last 24 years, and it's really a thrill.
Very good.
Hello, my name is Stephen Adkins. I'm chief of the Chickahominy Indian tribe. I grew up in Charles City County and lived there all my life and went to school in Oklahoma, came back and obtained my BS from Virginia Commonwealth University.
Okay. Well, thank you all so very much. We'll start with the first question. Why is it relevant to talk about the founding in the first place?
I think there's a number of reasons that make it important to our country, both positive and negative. Mm-hmm. It's in the founding of the country that the rules and the structure that created our country were placed. And you can't understand how the government is supposed to work or when it's broken or not working properly without understanding that founding. All that's good in the United States comes out of that founding period. Unfortunately, some of what's bad in the United States comes from the same period. Mm-hmm. And so some of those issues we can also learn to repair or to move beyond by understanding some of the issues and the errors that were made in the past and not just the successes. Mm-hmm.
I personally like the way we are now sort of defining founding because, again, as Ron said, it was defined sort of one way or maybe another way in the past, but now, today, founding is not just the founding fathers of the United States of America or the signers of the Declaration of Independence, but it's other founders of other subject matters like religion. I am the founder or co-founder of the First Baptist Church. I am a theologian by degree, and that was really what my interest was when I came here to Williamsburg, that there is an opportunity to talk about the history of slavery, and especially Gowan pamphlet, who was enslaved here, how his rise out of slavery, out of the ashes of slavery, into becoming the first ordained black preacher. And he's considered one of the founders too now. And I think that's refreshing as far as museums throughout the United States are concerned.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
I think it's important. I think we need to reflect on where we are versus where we've been. I think as part of that journey to the more perfect union, we need to look at those basic tenets that were espoused in the Declaration of Independence that were really full of hypocrisy at the time. We hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal. The writer didn't mean that. I believe we're working to actualizing that. And a good example of why it didn't work the way it was intended, Abraham Lincoln said 77 years ago, our forefathers brought forth of this nation, continent and new nation, dedicated that proposition, all men are created equal. We've gathered today to test whether that nation or any other nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. So the fact that we said we hold these truths to be self-evident that all men are created equal wasn't based in fact, and it became painfully obvious to people as they journeyed those intervening years. I think of when Patrick Henry says, "Give me liberty or give me death." Well, he gave a lot of us death. Blacks and Indians, death was there. When I look further into the Declaration of Independence, Thomas Jefferson lifted up the fact that the king had cited insurrection among the savages on the frontier whose methods of warfare included killing all ages, all genders. And if you circle back to 1610, Lord Delaware ordered the annihilation of the Paspahegh tribe in its entirety. And I'm convinced that those people within the tribe who bore children were women. So killing women and children, the template was set in 1610, some 166 years before the Declaration of Independence. I say all of that still being proud to be an American, and I believe that we are on that journey to a more perfect union, but to get there, we need to understand where we began.
Absolutely.
I think taking the terminology of the Declaration of Independence and the preamble of the Constitution of the United States, taking those same words and redefining them, repackage them for our personal conveniences, how we want to see it done, and then producing sort of a new understanding of what those terms might mean. So we have an opportunity now to do such a thing.
And we have to reflect on how we were conditioned. As we support democratic countries, I look at Ukraine, which captures the news media every day.
Yes.
I think back to 1994 when 800,000 people perished in Africa and it didn't hit the airwaves.
Right.
What could we have done to shape and move forward to rescue those people had we been exposed to it?
Right.
800,000 souls.
That's absolutely true.
Absolutely. So how do we get at the relevance of our history without stretching it or bending it to fit modern political ends?
I think we need to tell the story. Life is all at once comedy and tragedy. And you've got to tell both facets of it. There are some painful things in my family's history. But if I share my history with hope and leave that out, then you're bereft of some of that history. So as we go back and look at the history of these United States of America, we need to tell it like it is. And that doesn't involve bending or straightening. It involves just presenting facts. There's a concern out there that people will feel badly when they hear the truth. Well, I felt badly when I heard the story of how savage my people were, not realizing they were defending their homelands, they were defending women and children.
I think one of the challenges is that people don't all define history the same way. Recently I was reading a news article that was referring to how we need to change who we're honoring with history. History is not really supposed to be about honoring. I'm not saying that you don't give people credit where credit is due, but history is supposed to be a record of what happened. Just like Chief Adkins said, it is not supposed to be pushing my agenda or celebrating the people I want to be celebrating. It's supposed to be teaching what did happen. And that's where history is at its most powerful, because history is supposed to be teaching us how to continue and where to do in the future. And you're not going to learn or improve anything by not understanding the mistakes that were made in the future, in the past.
That's exactly what's wrong with the problems now what they have in the United States now. There's a call for no teaching of history in the schools, and kind of a backlash of us here at Colonial Williamsburg especially, talking about this, trying not to sugarcoat it, try to put forth, even if it brings one to tears or brings one to some kind of a moment in their life where they realize that, my God, what I had been taught or what I had thought is just so completely different. I need to make some changes or whatever. But now you got an element now completely trying to keep history out of schools and not teaching. This is why we are very, very important. I think the relevancy of this museum today is 10 times more than it was even in years past.
And I believe if we teach history, if we teach facts, I can choose my hero.
There you go.
Absolutely.
And my hero won't be chosen for me. So I think you make a very valid point. tell the history, and those natural heroes will emerge to the audience. Without respect to color or
In a similar
gender.
fashion, though, I think it's important to remember, and I think it's an error we get into when we talk about heroes, is that people are people. That nobody that we talk about isn't just a mortal with the various weaknesses and strengths that any mortal has. Nobody that we're talking about is perfect. And I think they're more interesting when you remember that.
Exactly.
And when you see the frailties and you see the errors as well as the strengths and what they've achieved. And it all is part of the tapestry that's history.
Exactly.
Absolutely, and that goes perfectly into our next question. There is such a strong mythology around the founding and around the revolution. So how do we get people to think and feel differently as we learn more and as new information becomes available to us thanks to ongoing research?
Well, I think just tell the story as we have come to understand it and learned it, research it. We've gone into repositories, we've gone into the libraries, we have connected up with people across the United States, across the world, other museums, to get a better understanding of what it is that we want to talk about, and give that information. And sometimes, to tell you the truth, we have to ourselves individually have to keep an open mind, because we might need to change how we interpret a particular thing. You know, we can't be so staunch in the way we believe things should be, because something could happen as far as an archaeologist could dig up something out of the ground and make us realize probably what we've been saying is not necessarily the truth. So we need to kind of curtail a little bit so we can give the guests the information as we know it, as much truth as possible.
When I look at the American Revolution and the life, the plight that the Native people found themselves in wasn't materially changed. I probably would have been one of the first to sign on with Lord Dunmore when he offered this, to blacks and Indians to come join me, and you'll be free and you'll be able to determine who you are. Being that era of self-determination. So that would have been very attractive to me. So I don't know that British rule to American rule changed the lives of people of color.
I think it may have in a negative fashion to some degree. I mean, it's not by some mistake that more American Indians were supporting the British cause than the American cause, because they recognized that the Americans living here were a far greater threat to them than the English living 3,000 miles away, in a similar fashion that the British were a greater threat than the French were in the previous war. My favorite example of a disaster to the American Indians is what happens with the Iroquois Confederation, where their strength and power is injured because of the war, because it diffused them. It separated their confederacy because they had taken different sides, and it ended up weakening one of the strongest forces they had for their defense.
In those words like the word savage and the word heathen and all these other words that people really didn't understand, how did these words become part of the identification of individuals? And of course, I know that did not necessarily come from a politician or come from even a king or judge. It came from a theologian. It came from a bishop of Canterbury, a bishop of London. Theologians of that particular period identified and labeled peoples like Indians and blacks and Irish and all the rest. These labels, it came from the church itself, the Church of England, as many will find me always railing against.
Unfortunately, just like we use history to push our present agendas, and I don't mean today, though we do it today, but in history they used history and they used theology and altered theology to fit their biases and their arguments.
If you're mandatorily required as a resident of a particular colony to attend church on a Sunday, at least one Sunday out of 4, but yet you have not the ability or to learn to read or to write, the only thing you can do is listen from the pulpit what that preacher is telling you, and what he's doing, basically more than likely indoctrinating you but not what thus says the Lord, what thus says the king, what thus says the bishop, what says the parliamentarians. Not really necessarily giving you the word of God that you came to that church to get. So,
And if you go back kind of an antecedent to what happened in England was 1452. Pope Nicholas V told King Ferdinand V that it's your God-given right. The papal bull of 1452, Doctrine of Discovery. So that was set in stone years before 1607, years before 1776. So again,
and you as a subject cannot debate that. You cannot go against that priest or go against that bishop because it's treason. You definitely can't go against the king or queen. That's treason. So we're teaching sort of how that time changed. We did no longer have to adhere to what said the monarch or what says the bishop.
I hope we're still teaching, though, that even while we're changing and while things, I mean, it is the age of enlightenment and things are improving.
Sure.
But they don't improve enough. They don't
Oh
continue.
no, they'll never go far enough.
I mean, one of my, Lincoln was mentioned earlier, and one of my favorite things I ever heard Lincoln say, which is along these lines, where the founding fathers are usually attacked for the hypocrisy and for the fail to meet everything they said. But Lincoln actually argued that the founding fathers laid the groundwork that allowed him to push forward with the Emancipation Proclamation. He recognized it for what it was, for an achievement that they had fall short of. All the founding fathers referred to the whole creation of our government as an experiment.
and I would readily concede that point, but I'll go back a second. When I look at the genocide that occurred here, that was given approval by the church.
Oh, absolutely.
Their first task was to exterminate
Yeah.
the native people,
And
the pagans and the savages, and they even
we
reached
keep
out.
mentioning Lincoln, and his only military involvement ever was wars against Indians, or a war against Indians.
Now, what would you all like to see next then for historic sites as well as schools and how they teach about the founding?
Well, I like, if I had my druthers about it, I would like to see everyone in the United States of America at some point come here.
They need to.
Well, I'm sort of biased. I'm sort of biased. I really think this should become like the new Mecca. You know, they need to come at least once in their life and hear how we're telling these stories. Spend some time, with your family and do the things you like to. But hear these stories now, sort of told in the right way. I think we're getting there. We're not there yet, but we're struggling.
I'd
I'd
like to see more subtlety. I don't think Americans like subtlety. I think they like things black and white, this way or that way.
Yeah.
And the real world is gray. In the modern world, we're seeing more of an interpretation, more information being brought out on the subjects we're talking about. And a lot of people act, particularly people who look like I do, act as if that's somehow an attack upon them or upon their culture or upon their heroes. It isn't. It's not. It's just. It's the full story. It's telling everything and understanding the complexity that real life in real history is. And I think that's important. It's important to remember that it isn't just history. Our lives are so complicated. Nobody fits into one category or the other that clearly or that cleanly. We're all individuals. We're more complicated than that. And I think that complication should be included, and people should recognize the muddy world that history really is.
Absolutely.
I think we need to teach history, and if it causes people to, if it stirs their emotions, if it causes them to cry, that's okay.
It's absolutely.
I was a big boy and I didn't cry on the outside, but I did on the inside.
If it doesn't, you're not really studying history.
True.
But we need to teach that history and let people
Absolutely.
form their own opinions. But you got to get at the truth. And if history doesn't evoke emotions, it's a pretty.
What good is it?
It's boring and dull.
Yeah,
Boring and dull.
History should be dynamic. It really should.
Absolutely.
The only other thing I would like to say on is I wish we'd stop dividing it. You've heard me say this before. We were asked once at a program we were doing if I thought, I think it was we both were thought, that people's knowledge of African American history, for instance, was suffering because not enough people were being pushed towards studying African American history. And my argument was, I think the problem was that we call it African American history. African American history, American Indian history, that should just be U.S. history.
Exactly.
It should be part of the whole story, and everybody should be learning it when they're learning their history, not in these segmented groups to people who are specifically looking for that segment.
Yeah, I think Native American History Month is a joke. If you teach history, if you teach the narrative as it is, which would include all of those cultures that comprise these United States of America, that's all you have to do.
Yeah.
All you have to do is teach history.
I watched a documentary about African American a month that was sponsored by an African American, and he specifically said he was against it. And the reason he said he was against it was very much the same reason you're giving. And in the end, he said, yeah, I'm against the idea of it, but we don't get what we should have. And that's why he said in the end, it's the best we can do. But it's just as silly. It's just as silly that we give 1 month to these subjects and that we don't extend it as part of the fuller story the whole rest of the year.
But Carter G. Woodson, Dr. Carter G. Woodson, the one that actually created the African American History Month, was just trying to get something out of that.
Absolutely.
Now, as
Absolutely.
we know, and as Chief said, truly enough, Ron, it is just not 1 month. It's every single day. Every time I wake up every day, it's African American History Month every single day of my life. And that's what we need to talk about it in that manner. Yes, in the holistic term, it is American history, and that's all inclusive of what the American story is all about. There's no separateness in that, and that's what we need to make clear to our audience, is that we see ourselves as not a degradation of trying to tear it down, but we try to even make it better by telling the truth.
It's a yes and.
And listen,
Not a one or the other.
Right.
It's it's a Black history, and
Yes.
it's American history.
Amen.
Often when I'm asked to go speak, they want me to wear 17th century clothing. I said, why should I do that? You guys have relegated me to the 17th century long enough.
Exactly.
I live and breathe today
I spent enough time in
in the 21st century.
Now,
Amen.
lastly, gentlemen, what do you think is one takeaway you would like to leave with the audience after watching this discussion?
I think I gave mine already. I'm very much of the opinion that we should study all history, and that we shouldn't be judging that history. We shouldn't base what we teach or what we learn on our judgment. We should learn the whole thing and get a better, fuller understanding. And remember that history is complicated and that people differ and that that everybody, or most people, have their strengths and their weaknesses. No one's perfect. But that it's not somehow a denigration of one culture to learn about the experiences of the other cultures. And particularly, I mean, we've left out other cultures that make up the United States.
Right,
But particularly the ones we're mentioning, who are such major players to the entire history.
Yes.
The entire post-Columbian history.
But the point you make is very real.
Right.
It's not you win, I lose.
Yeah.
It's a win-win situation
Absolutely.
when history is taught. And the takeaway that I would like to see from this discussion we're having today, which I think is a very meaningful discussion, is people have a renewed interest in hunger and thirst to learn history. I think we've done a disservice when we put so much emphasis on STEM while we need that,
Right.
but we don't do STEM at the expense of civics and history, because we have a generation that's been essentially bereft of those fundamentals that they gain in history and civics. And it turns out today, if I want to learn history, and this is not a plug for Colonial Williamsburg, but I've got to go to Colonial Williamsburg, I've got to go to Jamestown Yorktown Foundation, or the Virginia Humanities to learn history. So it's important that the work these organizations do, it's important that work continues until the school systems catch up with us. I mean, the curriculum must teach history. And I don't gain much pleasure, I gain no pleasure from knowing that the history books are published in Texas. So
That's a challenge in itself. I believe that if learning history, and when we're learning history, learn it chronologically as much as you can. Because I think just from a human standpoint, I know Dr. Carter G. Woodson wrote The Education of the Negro prior to 1861 chronologically. And if you read that book, it'll give you a better understanding of the connections of events, what happened here, what happened there. But he's done it chronologically, and I think it's easier to remember the history when you can read it in that fashion.
I agree with you if what you mean is knowing what causes what event, what leads on.
Yes.
I think the way history has often been taught, and was certainly being taught when I was young, where it was years and remembering this year and the year that happened, I think that's a disservice.
Well,
remembering
that's
that people are
been
humans
going
and telling
on.
the stories of people and reminding people that the people in history are people with the same interests and desires that any people have right now, the same worries and concerns. The details may have changed, but the basics, how I'm going to survive, how I'm going to feed my children, how I'm going to improve the life for my children, those haven't changed.
Right.
And I think that makes it a whole lot more interesting and dynamic than just a bunch of dates.
And if you walk down Main Street America today and ask people, what do you know about the Middle Passage? It's just like a deer in the headlights, and it's sad commentary as African Americans don't know it either. And why do they not know it? We've chosen not to teach it.
Right.
I'd like to thank all of you so very much, and thank you for joining me today. Now, turning now to the future, let's meet a teacher and some of her students who are turning lessons from the Revolution into civic action today.
I am Corey Yao, and I am a 6th grade U.S. history teacher at the Ball Chatham School District in Chatham, Illinois.
I'm Addison Nitz, and I'm a 7th grader at GMS.
We started the Change Project after I took in the process of taking the Guardians of Democracy micro-credential course from the Illinois Civics Hub, and this course focused on taking informed action through service learning. And through the class, I was able to develop the lesson plan for the project. And I did the class with my 6th grade U.S. history students, and it was after we finished studying the American Revolution and the founding documents. We started with the essential question, what type of citizens does a democracy need? And beginning our investigations, we first looked at the different types of citizens, personally responsible, participatory, and justice-oriented citizens. Students gathered research through a town hall meeting with an individual in charge of the James Project in our area. And they also collected survey data, and they examined the root causes for why individuals don't attempt to enact positive change. Based on this research, they were able to create public service announcements to inform individuals about the importance of making change and how they can become a participatory citizen. This transitioned us into the inquiry question of how can you use your voice to make positive change? When posed with this question, it was the catalyst for additional questions such as how do people make change and where do we start? Students then reflected on the methods that the colonists used to advocate and fight for change. During this process, we created a list of all the actions the colonists took, and we evaluated their effectiveness. Next, as a class, students looked at how individuals that we studied during Black History Month, how they enacted their own change, and we included their actions on a comprehensive list. To further complete the list, we analyzed current young engaged citizens, their passions that they were focused on, and the methods that they used to make change within their communities. Throughout this process, students developed an awareness and a wide variety of ways to make change and the means to accomplish their goals. Then came the initiative for my students to put their learning into action. Students were asked to brainstorm topics that they were passionate about and areas in which they would like to see change. This guided students to narrow their focus and to create a plan of action. The plans varied from writing letters to politicians and school board members, raising awareness for the LGBTQ plus community, Black Lives Matter, animal rights, protecting the environment, and providing support for local businesses during the heart of the COVID-19 pandemic. I chose to tie it to the American Revolution because I felt like it was a very natural connection, because the colonists provided models both positive and negative as to how to make change, but these models were for future citizens of America and also for individuals in other countries to advocate for change in the name of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Their determination to stand up for their ideals and beliefs is the whole reason why our country is set up the way that it is, and that Americans currently have the rights and freedoms that they possess today, and even the ability to continue to advocate for change. I do believe that this project helped open their eyes to the complexities of the situation that the colonists were in and the struggles that they faced and the difficulty navigating those challenges, and also the difficulty and complexity of creating a government that would fit the needs of its people. When we think of our founding of our country and the Constitution, hopefully they understand how everything was included with purpose, and it was designed to allow we the people to constantly advocate and strive for a more perfect union. The goal for students was to realize that not only the connection between the past and the present, but also how to learn from the past to progress and to grow as a nation and to continue that progress all the way for generations to come. There will always be a constant need for our country's improvement. Therefore, it's important to know that their voice does matter and that they can make change regardless of their age. Hopefully, they also understood the process for advocating for change and realized that they have the tools to do so.
My project's purpose was to help local businesses in Central Illinois that were suffering due to COVID-19. So much change had happened since COVID started, and it was taking a toll on a lot of the smaller businesses and specifically local businesses. My mom created a Facebook group and asked family and friends to support local businesses and take a picture of themselves at a local business and post it in this Facebook group. This project lasted a month, and we asked participants to donate a $1 donation toward the challenge. And at the end of the month, we drew 3 winners to receive gift cards to their favorite local business with the money that they donated. There were 28 members in the Facebook group, and the group's message was shared and viewed by many more people. This project made me realize how hard it can be to make an impact or change, and I found myself considering how hard it must have been for the colonists to gain their independence, taking them about 8 years, I believe, to do so. It makes me think that although my project wasn't a huge and important on a large scale, it made a difference for some small business owners in our community, and overall, I am determined that no amount of change is too big or too small, as long as I follow through with it in the future. I realized that if a young girl like myself can help make an impact in our community, I can also make a larger difference for ideas in the future. For example, I could look forward to making a change by helping out homeless people or volunteering in a nursing home, anything to really make a difference. Even though it could still be small, it could still make a bigger difference.
Thank you so much to Ms. Yao and her students for sharing their ideas and their work with us. And thank all of you for joining us for this discussion of our shared past, present, and future.